Hi, welcome to Raaonline. Today we are going to see a topic, paranasal sinuses. So what are paranasal sinuses? Before we come to that, let us see what are the competencies of CBME which we are going to deal today. It is AN 37.2 and AN 37.3. Describe the location and functional anatomy of paranasal sinuses. Describe the anatomical basis of sinusitis and maxillary sinus tumors. Let's see. What are paranasal sinuses? The term para means parallel to or on either side. So, there are some sinuses, means some spaces or cavities, which are located on either side or parallel to the nose, the nasal cavities. They are the paranasal air sinuses. These are called air sinuses because they contain air. There are several other sinuses also in our body, like the dural venous sinuses, where inside the spaces there is venous blood. Here we have air inside these sinuses. So, how many are there? Paranasal air sinuses are arranged in the form of, there are a pair of frontal sinuses, then a pair of maxillary sinuses. So, frontal sinuses are present here above. This blue in color here is the nasal cavity. This one is the nostril, the anterior nasal opening. So, this is the nostril. This blue in color is the nasal cavity. So, above the nasal cavity on either side in this area would be the frontal sinuses, paired ones. On either side of the nasal cavity, here is the maxillary sinuses, paired ones. Now, behind the nasal cavity and also a little above is the sphenoidal sinuses, which are also paired ones. And above the nasal cavity, here near the roof of the nasal cavity, here you have the ethmoidal sinuses. The ethmoidal sinuses are arranged in the form of three subgroups. Each of them are paired. So, there is a pair of anterior ethmoidal air sinuses, a pair of middle ethmoidal air sinuses, and a pair of posterior ethmoidal air sinuses. So, this is a pair of frontal air sinus, pair of maxillary air sinus on either side, the sphenoidal air sinuses on either side, and this one is anterior, middle and posterior ethmoidal air sinuses of either sides. Now, how do they develop? The paranasal air sinuses develop related to the nasal cavity itself. So, the lining epithelium of the nasal cavity, they extend into the paranasal air sinuses. So, the respiratory epithelium itself lines the paranasal air sinuses, which is the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. This one is the anterior view where you can see the paranasal air sinuses. This is frontal. This one is frontal, ethmoidal. This is only schematic representation, ethmoid, and this is the maxillary of one side. Here in this lateral view, this one is frontal, this is ethmoidal, this is sphenoidal, and this would be the position of the maxillary air sinus. So, where are these air sinuses present? It is present between the two tables of the skull bone. This is the outer table and the inner table of the frontal bone. Between the two tables is the frontal air sinus. Similarly, related to the ethmoid bone, related to the two tables of the ethmoid bone is the ethmoidal air sinus. Inside the maxilla bone is the maxillary air sinus, and inside the sphenoid bone is inside the body of the sphenoid bone is the sphenoidal air sinuses. Now, where do they open? As we have already seen, the paranasal air sinuses develop as outpouchings from the nasal cavity. So, they open into the nasal cavity itself. Which part of the nasal cavity? To the lateral wall of the nose. So, this is a view, a schematic representation of the lateral wall of the nose. Lateral wall of the nose. And you remember the shelf-like projections in the lateral wall of the nose are called the concha. So, this one is the superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha. So, this is superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and this is the inferior nasal concha. And what are the areas related to beneath these conchae called? Between the superior and the middle is the superior meatus of nose. Between the middle and the inferior is the middle meatus of nose, and between the inferior nasal, below the inferior nasal concha is the inferior meatus of the nose. Above the superior nasal concha is a space called the sphenoethmoidal recess. It is present above the superior nasal concha. Now, the openings, based on the openings of the paranasal sinuses, are classified into two types. One is the anterior group, which open into the middle meatus of the nasal cavity. Other is the posterior group, which do not open into the middle meatus. They open somewhere else. So, which nasal sinuses fall under which category? The anterior group is made up of, as we have already seen, they open into this space, the middle meatus of nose. In the middle meatus of nose, there is an elevation. The elevation is called the bulla ethmoidalis. This elevation here is called the bulla ethmoidalis. So, a group of paranasal air sinuses open into the bulla ethmoidalis. Which group? The middle ethmoidal air sinus. And below the bulla ethmoidalis is a space called hiatus semilunaris. The semilunar space here is called the hiatus semilunaris. Into the hiatus semilunaris opens the frontal air sinus, then the anterior ethmoidal air sinus, and also maxillary air sinus.